Chelsea Baker stood silently in the marble lobby as her husband Timothy pointed toward the revolving doors and told security to escort her out. Residents slowed their steps. The concierge lowered his eyes. Beside Timothy, Madison Carter smiled as if the victory already belonged to her. Timothy announced that Chelsea no longer had any right to live in his penthouse or remain inside his towers. Chelsea said nothing. She simply glanced once at the bronze ownership plaque mounted on the wall, a plaque Timothy had walked past for years without ever understanding. By the time he finally learned whose name truly controlled every luxury tower leaving, would be the smallest thing he would lose. If you believe dignity is strongest when it stays calm, let us know where you're watching from and your local time in the comments. We'd love to see how far this story travels. And if stories of quiet strength, truth, and justice speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Chicago greeted the morning with its usual confidence. Glass towers reflected the pale sunlight across the Chicago River while commuters hurried beneath them, each convinced that the city rewarded only those willing to fight harder than everyone else. Among those towers stood Baker Luxury Towers, an elegant collection of residential high-rises known for understated sophistication rather than flashy extravagance. Their polished stone facades, discreet security, and impeccable service attracted executives, diplomats, surgeons, entrepreneurs, and families who valued privacy above publicity. Very few people knew who actually owned them. Even fewer had ever met the owner. Chelsea Baker preferred it that way. Most mornings began long before the city reached full speed. She woke before sunrise, brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen of the penthouse, and spent 20 minutes writing in a leather notebook whose pages contained observations rather than complaints. She recorded dates, conversations, promises people made, and small changes in behavior that most others overlooked. She had developed the habit from her father years earlier. Facts become priceless when memories become convenient, he had once told her. Chelsea never forgot those words. The notebook resting beside her coffee cup had become more valuable than expensive jewelry. It held no secrets about money, only the truth about people. She lived simply despite occupying one of the most valuable residences in downtown Chicago. Her clothes were elegant, but never extravagant. She drove an ordinary luxury sedan that attracted little attention. She rarely attended charity galas unless absolutely necessary. Employees throughout Baker Luxury Towers knew her only as a polite resident who always thanked the concierge, remembered maintenance workers by name, and quietly left generous holiday bonuses without asking anyone to notice. No one suspected they were speaking with the woman whose signature ultimately approved every major decision affecting the buildings. That anonymity had never been accidental. Years earlier, after the death of her parents, the Baker Family Trust had transferred complete beneficial ownership to Chelsea. Rather than placing every property directly under her own name, the family's attorneys had preserved the structure her grandfather had spent decades creating. Each tower belonged to a different holding company. Each holding company answered to Baker Property Holdings. Baker Property Holdings reported to the Baker Family Trust. Chelsea served as the trust's sole beneficiary and final decision-maker, while independent trustees handled public administration to protect both privacy and security. The arrangement prevented unwanted publicity. It also protected the business from people who valued appearances more than substance, including though Chelsea had never imagined it would matter one day her own husband. Timothy possessed the kind of confidence that often impressed strangers before they knew him well. At 39, he had established himself as director of project development for a respected real estate investment company. His colleagues admired his negotiation skills, his ability to command a meeting, and his willingness to pursue ambitious opportunities that others considered too risky. He enjoyed introducing himself with his title. He enjoyed expensive watches. He enjoyed conversations that reminded people of his growing success. Years earlier, those traits had seemed like healthy ambition. Over time, they had become something else. Chelsea remembered when Timothy celebrated promotions by bringing home flowers. Now he celebrated by bringing home stories about people who admired him. The difference seemed small at first. Then it became impossible to ignore. That morning, Timothy entered the kitchen while fastening the buttons of a tailored navy suit. He barely glanced toward Chelsea before checking messages on his phone. "Big meeting today," he said. Chelsea smiled softly. "I hope it goes well." "It will." He poured coffee without looking at her. "The investors finally understand who's driving the company forward." Chelsea nodded. "I'm sure they appreciate your work." Timothy smiled to himself. They appreciate leadership. The conversation ended there. Not because either of them had argued. Because silence had gradually replaced curiosity inside their marriage. Chelsea watched him gather his briefcase before leaving. "Have a good day," she said. "You too." The apartment door closed. She listened to the quiet that followed. It had become the loudest sound in their home. Their marriage had not collapsed overnight. It had changed through hundreds of ordinary moments. Missed dinners, unanswered questions, conversations interrupted by phone calls, weekends replaced by business trips, compliments replaced by criticism disguised as advice. Timothy never shouted. He simply became increasingly convinced that everything around him reflected his own achievement. Chelsea had noticed it months before anyone else. She had written about it in her notebook, February 11th. Timothy spoke for 23 minutes about himself during dinner. Asked nothing about my day. March 2nd, he referred to our home as my place while speaking with co-workers. April 18th, he introduced me as my wife without mentioning my name. Small details, easy to dismiss individually, impossible to ignore together. Chelsea never confronted him with those observations. She preferred evidence over emotion. Across the city, Timothy arrived at his office energized by the attention waiting for him. Employees greeted him enthusiastically. Junior associates hurried to prepare presentation materials. His assistant organized the day's meetings with practiced efficiency. The recognition satisfied him. He believed he had earned every bit of it. Perhaps he had. But success has a quiet habit of persuading people they deserve credit for circumstances they never created. Timothy rarely asked questions about Chelsea's family. He knew her parents had passed away years ago. He knew they had been involved in commercial real estate. He knew there had been investments. Beyond that, he had never shown much interest. Whenever Chelsea attempted to discuss family trustees' estate meetings or annual reviews with attorneys, Timothy usually responded with polite indifference. "As long as it doesn't interfere with our plans," he would say. Eventually, Chelsea stopped mentioning them altogether. It seemed easier. The annual trust meetings continued without him. Legal documents arrived. Financial reports were reviewed. Major renovations received approval. New acquisitions moved forward. Chelsea handled every responsibility quietly, often through secure video conferences, scheduled while Timothy traveled for work. He never asked where she was going. She never volunteered explanations he did not want to hear. That mutual silence gradually widened into distance. Late that afternoon, Chelsea attended one such meeting in a discreet conference room inside Baker Property Holdings. The executives greeted her respectfully, not because of wealth, because she knew every building better than anyone else. She remembered which elevators required modernization, which elderly residents preferred ground floor access, which employees deserved promotion, which security improvements had reduced emergency response times. She asked detailed questions, She listened more than she spoke. When discussions ended, every executive left with clear direction. One board member smiled. "Your father would be proud." Chelsea answered quietly. "He taught me the buildings matter less than the people inside them." No one argued. They had heard her repeat that principle for years. It guided every major decision she made. As Chelsea exited through a private garage, she noticed several maintenance employees finishing a difficult repair after regular hours. She stopped. "Everything under control?" One technician smiled with surprise. "Yes, ma'am. Just replacing a damaged valve." She thanked each worker personally. Then she instructed management to authorize overtime meals for the entire crew. It took less than 30 seconds. No speeches, no photographs, no publicity. Just another note entered into tomorrow's operational report. That evening, she returned home before Timothy. She prepared dinner, set the table for two, waited. The food gradually cooled. At nearly 9 o'clock, Timothy finally walked through the door. He looked pleased with himself. The meeting went even better than expected. "I'm glad. We're discussing a huge opportunity." Chelsea served his dinner. "That sounds exciting." Timothy sat down. "You know, people finally recognize who's making things happen." Chelsea looked at him for a long moment. Not with disappointment, not with anger, simply with quiet curiosity. She wondered when appreciation had transformed into entitlement, when confidence had become certainty, when partnership had become ownership. She wrote nothing that night. She simply watched. Because experience had taught her something more reliable than instinct, people rarely reveal themselves during difficult days. They reveal themselves after believing they have already won. Spring settled comfortably over Chicago, bringing longer afternoons and warmer evenings. The city seemed lighter, as though every polished window reflected fresh ambition. Inside Timothy's office, however, ambition had begun taking a different shape. Her name was Madison Carter. At 29, Madison possessed the kind of confidence that entered a room before she did. She dressed with impeccable precision, spoke with calculated warmth, and seemed to understand exactly what every influential person wanted to hear. She had been hired as Timothy's executive assistant after his previous assistant accepted a position in New York. During her first week, Madison impressed nearly everyone. She remembered names after one introduction. She anticipated schedules before meetings changed. She organized presentations that appeared effortless. Most importantly, she understood how to make successful people feel even more successful. Timothy noticed immediately. "You learn fast," he told her after a client presentation. Madison smiled modestly. "I pay attention. You've made my job easier. I just make sure talented people get the attention they deserve." The compliment lingered longer than either of them acknowledged. From that day forward, Madison became a constant presence beside Timothy. Morning briefings became working breakfasts. Afternoon planning sessions stretched into evening strategy meetings. Business dinners multiplied. Weekend conference calls became routine. None of it seemed inappropriate when viewed individually. Together, however, they quietly redrew the boundaries of Timothy's life. Chelsea noticed. She did not accuse, she observed. The notebook returned to the kitchen table. April 27th. New assistant mentioned 4 times during dinner. May 3rd. Business meeting extended until 10:40 p.m. Calendar showed it ending at 7. May 9th. Timothy smiled while reading messages during breakfast. Not once did Chelsea ask to see his phone. Trust, she believed, could not survive inspection. If evidence became necessary, something far more important had already disappeared. One Friday evening, Timothy hosted several colleagues at an upscale steakhouse overlooking the river. Chelsea had originally been invited, but shortly before leaving, Timothy casually mentioned that the dinner had become strictly business. She accepted the explanation without argument. Hours later, while reviewing maintenance reports from Baker Luxury Towers, her phone vibrated. A photograph had appeared on social media. Several employees from Timothy's company stood around a large table raising glasses in celebration. Timothy occupied the center. Madison stood beside him, closer than any assistant usually would. The caption read, "Great night celebrating another successful quarter with the best leadership team." Chelsea enlarged the image. Everyone else appeared engaged in conversation. Timothy and Madison were looking at each other. Not the camera, each other. She locked the phone, opened her notebook. No dramatic conclusions, only facts. Photo posted 8:16 p.m. business dinner included social celebration. Assistant standing beside Timothy throughout event. She closed the notebook. Evidence deserved patience. Speculation deserved none. Across town, Madison leaned comfortably against the restaurant balcony. "The team's lucky to have someone like you," she said. Timothy laughed. "I've worked for everything I've accomplished." "I know." Madison looked toward Chicago's skyline. "Some people are simply meant to build bigger things." Timothy appreciated conversations like these. They required nothing from him except agreement. Madison never challenged his opinions, never questioned his decisions, never reminded him about forgotten anniversaries or missed family dinners. She reflected the version of himself he most enjoyed seeing. As weeks passed, Madison became increasingly curious about Timothy's wife. One afternoon, she asked casually while organizing travel documents, "So, what does Chelsea do?" Timothy barely looked up. "Not much." Madison waited. He continued signing papers. "She handles some family matters." "Family business?" "I honestly couldn't explain it." He shrugged. "Her parents left investments or something." Madison nodded thoughtfully. "Must be nice." Timothy smiled. "I've always been the one focused on building a career." The statement sounded harmless, yet it quietly erased years of Chelsea's responsibilities. Madison accepted it without question. She began creating an image of Chelsea entirely from Timothy's descriptions. A quiet woman, comfortable, dependent, sheltered, living well because of her husband's success. The truth never entered the conversation. Madison never asked whether Timothy had seen financial statements, never asked whose name appeared on property documents, never asked why Chelsea attended regular legal meetings. She simply accepted the explanation that best fit appearances. Appearances, after all, often seemed convincing. Back at the penthouse, Chelsea noticed other changes. Timothy had begun criticizing small things. The meals were too simple. The apartment felt dated. The artwork needed replacing. The concierge should respond faster. One evening, he paused beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. This place could be incredible with the right renovations. Chelsea looked up from her book. "What would you change?" "Almost everything." He gestured broadly. "Modern finishes, different lighting, new furniture." Chelsea smiled faintly. "It already feels like home." Timothy shook his head. "It feels old." She returned to reading. He never asked why certain design choices existed. If he had, he might have learned that every material inside the penthouse had been personally selected years earlier by Chelsea's late mother. The walnut flooring, the handcrafted fireplace, the custom library shelves. None of it reflected outdated taste. It reflected family history. Timothy saw decoration. Chelsea saw memory. Neither explained their perspective. Another note entered the notebook later that evening. May 21st. He criticized nearly every room, did not recognize any personal history attached to them. Several days later, Chelsea attended another quarterly review with the trustees of Baker Family Trust. Richard Hayes, the family's longtime attorney, distributed confidential reports around the conference table. Occupancy remained high. Maintenance costs were under budget. A new acquisition outside Boston had exceeded expectations. Everything appeared stable. Then Richard looked toward Chelsea. "There is one matter you should know." She raised her eyes. "What is it?" "One of your husband's recent development proposals references luxury residential assets." Chelsea listened quietly. "The proposal doesn't involve our buildings," Richard continued. "But several investors apparently assume he has access to premium residential holdings." Chelsea considered that for a moment. "Has he claimed ownership?" "Not directly." Richard chose his words carefully. "But he hasn't corrected those assumptions either." Silence settled across the room. One trustee finally spoke. "Do you want us to intervene?" Chelsea answered immediately. "No." Richard looked at her. "You understand where this could lead." "I do. And if it continues," Chelsea closed the report, "then we'll respond with facts." Richard had represented the Baker family for over 25 years. He recognized that expression. Chelsea had reached a decision. She would not act from emotion. She would wait until evidence completed the story. Meanwhile, Timothy's confidence continued growing. Madison praised nearly every presentation. Clients complimented his leadership. Industry magazines published interviews featuring his latest projects. Each success made him slightly less interested in listening to anyone who disagreed with him, especially Chelsea. One Saturday morning, they attended a neighborhood brunch hosted by longtime friends. Conversation drifted naturally from travel to careers to real estate. Someone admired the penthouse. "You two are lucky," one guest said. Timothy smiled confidently. "I've worked hard to give us that lifestyle." Chelsea quietly stirred her coffee. Another guest asked, "Do you ever think about moving?" Timothy laughed. "I'll probably own something even bigger before long." Several people nodded approvingly. No one noticed Chelsea's brief glance toward the window. She offered no correction, no explanation, no embarrassment. She simply allowed the words to remain exactly where Timothy had placed them. On the drive home, he seemed unusually cheerful. People respect success. Chelsea watched passing buildings through the passenger window. They respect honesty, too. Timothy frowned slightly. What does that mean? She turned back toward him. Nothing. He accepted the answer. But for the first time in months, something about her calm unsettled him. Not because she sounded angry, because she sounded certain. That evening, Chelsea added only one sentence to her notebook, May 31st. Confidence becomes dangerous when it no longer needs the truth. She closed the notebook. Outside, the lights of Baker Luxury Towers illuminated the Chicago skyline exactly as they had every evening for years. Steady, quiet, unmoved by the people who believed they controlled them. June arrived with relentless heat, and Chicago's skyline shimmered beneath cloudless skies. Business magazines praised an expanding real estate market. Investment firms competed for landmark developments, and executives spoke confidently about growth that seemed impossible to slow. Timothy embraced the optimism with increasing enthusiasm. Every headline confirmed what he already believed, that bigger opportunities belonged to people bold enough to claim them. Chelsea noticed the change before anyone else. Not because Timothy said more, because he began hiding more. His business trips became longer. Dinner reservations were canceled with shorter notice. His phone rarely left his hand. Even when they sat together in the living room, he seemed to occupy another world, entirely smiling at messages that never included her. Chelsea refused to search through his belongings. She refused to guess. Instead, she continued doing what she had always done. She observed. She documented. She waited. One Tuesday evening, Timothy stepped onto the balcony to answer a phone call. The sliding glass door remained slightly open, allowing fragments of his conversation to drift inside. "Don't worry about the paperwork." A pause. "I'll handle the apartment." Another pause. "No, she won't make this difficult." Chelsea looked up from the financial report she had been reading. She heard nothing else. Timothy returned a minute later, slipped his phone into his pocket, and smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. "Everything okay?" Chelsea asked. "Just work." She nodded once. "I see." There was no accusation in her voice, only acknowledgement. Later that night, after Timothy had fallen asleep, Chelsea opened her notebook. June 7th. Phone conversation. Mentioned paperwork. Mentioned apartment. Said, "She won't make this difficult." No conclusions, only facts. The following morning, Chelsea attended her quarterly review with Baker Property Holdings. The meeting took place inside a discreet conference room overlooking the river, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed much of downtown Chicago. Around the table sat department directors responsible for operations, finance, legal affairs, and long-term development. Richard Hayes arrived carrying 2 thick folders. "Good morning, Chelsea." "Morning, Richard." The meeting proceeded efficiently. Occupancy rates remained excellent. Resident satisfaction had improved again. Security upgrades at 3 buildings had reduced emergency response times. Chelsea listened carefully, asking questions about maintenance schedules, staffing levels, and tenant feedback. Numbers mattered. People mattered more. Near the end of the meeting, Richard cleared his throat. "There's another issue." Chelsea looked toward him. "What kind of issue?" "Our compliance department flagged several public investment presentations." He slid a folder across the table. The presenter was Timothy. Chelsea remained composed. Richard continued. "He never directly claims ownership of Baker Luxury Towers." Chelsea opened the folder. "But he allows investors to assume he has significant residential property control." Inside were printed presentation slides, promotional materials, and transcripts from recent conferences. Several investors had asked questions regarding premium residential assets. Timothy's answers had been carefully worded, technically truthful, intentionally misleading. Chelsea read quietly. No expression crossed her face. One executive spoke. "Should we issue a formal correction?" Richard turned toward Chelsea. "The decision is yours." She closed the folder. "Not yet." Silence settled across the room. Richard understood immediately. "You believe he'll go further," Chelsea answered calmly. People rarely stop when dishonesty starts rewarding them. No one disagreed. The meeting continued. Outside the conference room, Chicago bustled with ordinary life. Inside, preparations had quietly begun for something much larger. That Friday evening, Timothy returned home unusually cheerful. "I've got great news." Chelsea looked up from preparing dinner. "What happened?" "My firm's considering me for a major partnership." "Congratulations. They're impressed with my vision." "I'm happy your work is being recognized." Timothy poured himself a glass of wine. "It changes everything." Chelsea placed dinner on the table. "In what way?" "I'll finally have the authority I've always deserved." The sentence lingered. Chelsea noticed he no longer spoke about shared goals. Everything had become personal. My career, my success, my authority, my future. She remembered a time when he said "are." That word had quietly disappeared. After dinner, Timothy carried several documents into his office. Normally, he closed the door. That night, he left it slightly open. Chelsea passed by later while taking tea upstairs. She had no intention of reading anything, but one page resting near the edge of the desk caught her attention. Across the top appeared the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." She stopped walking. Only for a second. She neither entered the room nor touched the document. She continued upstairs exactly as she had intended. Inside her bedroom, she sat beside the window overlooking the illuminated city. The filing confirmed what months of observations had already suggested. Still, certainty felt different from suspicion. She opened her notebook. June 14th. Observed draft divorce petition on desk. Did not examine contents. Evidence now consistent with prior observations. She closed the notebook. No tears came. Not because the discovery caused no pain, because grief had been arriving quietly for months. The document merely gave it a name. Over the following week, Timothy became increasingly distracted. He scheduled meetings outside normal hours. He frequently mentioned his attorney. Whenever Chelsea asked about his day, he answered briefly before changing the subject. Meanwhile, Madison Carter's influence continued expanding. Several employees noticed that she attended meetings previously reserved for senior executives. She reviewed confidential presentations. She accompanied Timothy to investor dinners. Rumors circulated throughout the office. No one spoke openly. Everyone watched. One afternoon, Madison entered Timothy's office carrying coffee. "I found a downtown designer." "For what?" "The penthouse." Timothy smiled. "You've already started planning. We'll need changes." She unfolded several interior design sketches across his desk. Lighter colors. Different furniture. More contemporary. Timothy examined the drawings. "I like them." "What about Chelsea?" His answer came without hesitation. "She won't be there." Madison smiled. "I thought so." Neither realized someone outside the partially open office had heard those final words. A junior administrative assistant named Emily Foster had been delivering contracts to another department. She paused instinctively, not to eavesdrop, only because Timothy's sentence surprised her. Emily quietly continued walking. She said nothing, but the conversation remained in her memory. Across town, Chelsea met Richard Hayes for coffee rather than another formal legal session. Neither mentioned divorce immediately. Richard simply asked, "How are you holding up?" Chelsea stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I've accepted that something is ending. And the business? It must remain separate." Richard nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what your parents would have wanted." Chelsea looked through the cafe window. "I don't want revenge." "I know. I only want the truth documented correctly." Richard smiled faintly. "That's why we keep records." Chelsea reached into her bag and removed her leather notebook. She placed it gently on the table. "I've kept records too." Richard looked at the worn cover. "You've been writing all this time. Every important conversation. Every date. Every observation." He didn't ask to read it. He understood its value without opening a single page. Outside, summer tourists filled Chicago's sidewalks, unaware that two ordinary notebooks, one maintained by an experienced attorney, the other by a quiet woman almost everyone underestimated, would soon outweigh every confident assumption Timothy had built his future upon. Chelsea finished her tea, closed the notebook once more, and walked back into the afternoon sunlight. She still had no intention of stopping Timothy. Some lessons could not be taught. They could only be documented. The first Monday of July began with bright skies and an unusual stillness hanging over Baker Luxury Towers. The marble lobby gleamed beneath morning sunlight pouring through walls of glass. Residents crossed the polished floor carrying briefcases, gym bags, and coffee cups, exchanging familiar greetings with the concierge before disappearing into private elevators. To everyone else, it looked like another ordinary day. Chelsea knew it would not be. She had noticed the subtle pattern during the previous week. Timothy had become strangely impatient, checking his watch more often, making short phone calls from other rooms, and leaving without breakfast nearly every morning. He was waiting for something, or perhaps preparing for it. That morning, she dressed as she always did. Cream blouse, navy trousers, low heels, and a light jacket despite the summer warmth outside. Nothing about her appearance suggested confrontation. She looked like any resident beginning another workday. Timothy emerged from the bedroom carrying a leather portfolio. "We need to talk before you leave." Chelsea looked at him calmly. "I'm listening." "I've already spoken with my attorney." She nodded once. "I assumed you had." His expression tightened slightly. "I've decided it's time we end this marriage." Chelsea remained silent. "I've prepared the paperwork." He placed a thick envelope on the dining table. "I'd like you to review it." Chelsea looked at the envelope without touching it. "I'll have my attorney review anything that requires my signature." I expected that. Another silence settled between them. It was not hostile. It simply reflected two people who had already traveled too far apart to meet halfway. Timothy folded his arms. "There's something else." Chelsea waited. "I want you to move out of the penthouse this week." She lifted her eyes. "This week?" "Yes." He spoke with complete confidence. "I'll continue living here." Chelsea asked only one question. "Why?" Timothy seemed surprised she had asked at all. "Because it's the practical solution." "For whom?" "For both of us." Chelsea held his gaze for several seconds. "This is your final decision?" "It is." She nodded gently. "I understand." No argument followed. No raised voices. No emotional appeal. Timothy had prepared himself for resistance. Instead, he found acceptance. Oddly, that unsettled him more. Chelsea picked up her handbag. "I have meetings today." "So do I." She walked toward the front door. "We'll speak again." Timothy watched her leave. For a brief moment, he wondered why she appeared so composed. Then he dismissed the thought. He believed certainty belonged to him. Late that afternoon, Timothy returned to Baker Luxury Towers earlier than usual. Madison Carter accompanied him. She wore a fitted white blazer and carried several shopping bags from expensive home furnishing stores. The concierge greeted them politely. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cole." Timothy smiled. "I'll need security nearby in a few minutes." The concierge hesitated. "Is everything all right, sir?" "It will be." Madison glanced around the elegant lobby with open satisfaction. "I still can't believe this place." Timothy slipped an arm around her waist. "It'll feel different once we make it ours." Neither noticed Daniel Brooks standing near the management office reviewing maintenance schedules. Daniel had managed luxury residential properties for over 20 years. Experience had taught him that genuine authority rarely announced itself loudly. He watched quietly. Something about Timothy's confidence felt unusual. Upstairs, Chelsea had just returned from a meeting with Richard Hayes. Their discussion had been brief. Richard had reviewed the divorce petition. He had also finalized additional documentation unrelated to the marriage. Everything was prepared, exactly as planned. Chelsea entered the penthouse, placed her notebook beside the kitchen counter, and poured herself a glass of water. Less than 5 minutes later, the front door opened. Timothy entered first. Madison followed without hesitation. Chelsea looked toward them. Neither surprise nor anger crossed her face. Madison smiled politely. "I hope we're not interrupting." Chelsea answered simply, "You weren't expected." Timothy set his portfolio on the dining table. "I wanted Madison to see the apartment." Chelsea remained standing. "I see." Madison slowly walked through the living room, admiring the artwork. "The view is incredible." Timothy smiled proudly. "I told you." Chelsea watched quietly. Every painting Madison admired had been selected years earlier by Chelsea's parents. Every piece of furniture carried family memories. To Timothy and Madison, they looked like expensive decorations. To Chelsea, they represented people no longer alive. The difference remained invisible. Madison stopped beside the grand piano. "This room has amazing potential." Timothy laughed. "We'll redesign most of it." Chelsea looked toward him. Madison answered before Timothy could. "Timothy asked me to help." Chelsea simply nodded. "I understand." Madison expected irritation. Instead, she encountered courtesy. That unexpected calm made her strangely uncomfortable. Timothy cleared his throat. "I think it's better if we're completely honest." Chelsea waited. "I'm asking you to leave tonight." Silence filled the room. Outside, the city continued moving as though nothing significant had happened. Inside the penthouse, years of marriage quietly reached their breaking point. Chelsea spoke softly. "Tonight?" "Yes. I've already arranged everything." Madison folded her arms confidently. "It would probably make things easier for everyone." Chelsea looked directly at Madison. "I wasn't asking you." Madison's smile faded, only slightly. Timothy stepped forward. "This isn't a discussion." Chelsea considered his words carefully. Then she asked another simple question. "Do you believe you have the authority to remove me?" "I know I do." She nodded once. "Very well." She walked toward the hallway. Timothy frowned. "Where are you going?" "To collect a few personal items." "I thought you'd argue." Chelsea paused briefly. "What would that accomplish?" He had no answer. 15 minutes later, she returned carrying one medium-sized suitcase. Nothing else. Not photographs, not artwork, not jewelry. Only clothing, her notebook, and several folders. Madison looked surprised. "That's all you're taking?" "For today." Timothy opened the apartment door. "We should go downstairs." Chelsea understood immediately. He wanted witnesses. He wanted the building to see that he had removed her. She accepted without comment. The elevator descended in complete silence. Madison stood between them, checking her reflection in the mirrored wall. Timothy watched the floor numbers. Chelsea watched neither. When the elevator doors opened, the lobby remained busy with residents returning from work. Conversations gradually stopped as people noticed the unusual group. Daniel Brooks looked up from the reception desk. "Good evening." Timothy spoke before anyone else could. "Daniel, I need security." The lobby became noticeably quieter. 2 security officers approached respectfully. "Is there a problem, sir?" Timothy gestured toward Chelsea. "My wife is moving out." Chelsea said nothing. Timothy continued. "Her access to the penthouse will no longer be necessary." Several residents exchanged uncertain glances. Madison stood confidently beside him. Daniel stepped forward carefully. "Mr. Cole, building policy requires—" Timothy interrupted. "I know the policy." His voice became louder. I'm instructing management that Chelsea Baker no longer has permission to occupy my residence. The words echoed across the marble lobby. Every conversation stopped. The concierge lowered his eyes. One elderly resident slowly removed his glasses. Even the revolving doors seemed quieter. Chelsea stood holding her single suitcase. She neither defended herself nor corrected Timothy. Daniel looked toward her, then back toward Timothy. Years of experience told him something was wrong. Very wrong. But procedures existed for moments exactly like this. He chose his next words with care. Mr. Cole, before management makes any changes, certain ownership records must first be verified. Timothy smiled with visible impatience. That won't be necessary. Daniel remained calm. I'm afraid it is. Chelsea quietly adjusted her grip on the suitcase. For the first time that evening, she spoke. Daniel. Yes, Miss Baker. I'll be leaving now. He nodded respectfully. I understand. She turned toward the entrance without another word. No dramatic farewell, no accusation, no tears, only quiet footsteps crossing polished marble. Behind her, Timothy believed he had finally taken control. He never noticed that Daniel Brooks was no longer looking at Chelsea. The building manager was watching Timothy instead. And for the first time, he had begun wondering a question that would soon change everything. Who actually had the authority here? Chelsea spent her first night away from the penthouse in a quiet suite reserved for executives inside another Baker Luxury Towers property on the north side of Chicago. The room overlooked the lake instead of the river, and although it offered every comfort, it felt unfamiliar. She unpacked only the essentials: 2 changes of clothes, a folder of legal documents, her laptop, and the worn leather notebook that had become her most faithful companion. She placed the notebook beside the window. For several minutes, she simply watched the light spread across the water. She thought about her parents. She thought about the years she and Timothy had shared before ambition slowly replaced gratitude. She thought about the moment in the lobby when dozens of strangers had watched her walk away without defending herself. The humiliation had been real. But humiliation was temporary. Documentation lasted much longer. Chelsea opened the notebook. July 8th. Removed from residence in presence of residence concierge, building manager, and security personnel. No physical confrontation. Witnesses present. Building manager requested ownership verification before complying. She closed the notebook. Then she picked up her phone. Good evening, Richard. The attorney answered immediately. I've been expecting your call. It happened. I heard. You already know. Daniel Brooks contacted our office less than 30 minutes ago. Chelsea looked toward the skyline. What did he say? He said something about tonight didn't feel right. She allowed herself the faintest smile. That's Daniel. Richard continued. He refused to alter residency records until ownership documentation was verified. He followed procedure. He did. A brief silence followed. Richard finally asked, Are you ready? Chelsea did not answer immediately. She understood exactly what he meant. For months, she had postponed formal action, not because she lacked evidence, because she hoped Timothy might stop before causing irreversible damage. Now that possibility had disappeared. Yes, she said quietly. I'm ready. The following morning, Richard Hayes arrived at the headquarters of Baker Property Holdings before 8 o'clock. The legal department had already prepared the conference room. Waiting inside were senior compliance officers, 2 outside attorneys specializing in trust law representatives from the accounting firm that audited Baker Family Trust each year, and the trust administrator, Margaret Ellis. No one spoke casually. Everyone understood the seriousness of the meeting. Richard placed several thick binders across the polished table. "We'll proceed chronologically." Margaret nodded. "Let's begin." The first binder contained the original trust documents signed more than 20 years earlier. The second contained corporate ownership records. The third included property deeds. The fourth documented every transfer of beneficial ownership after Chelsea inherited the trust. Each page had been certified. Each signature had been notarized. Each filing had been properly recorded. Nothing depended upon memory. Everything depended upon documentation. Richard addressed the room. "Our objective is not retaliation." No one interrupted. "Our objective is accuracy." He opened the first binder. Baker Family Trust remains the sole beneficial owner of Baker Property Holdings. Another page. Baker Property Holdings remains the parent company controlling every subsidiary that owns Baker Luxury Towers. Another page. Chelsea Baker is the sole beneficiary and final approval authority under the trust. Margaret looked around the table. Any questions regarding ownership? None. The answer had never changed. Only Timothy's assumptions had. Across town, Timothy entered his office in unusually high spirits. Madison followed, carrying coffee and several folders. "I've already scheduled your investor lunch." "Perfect. And the interior designer wants access to the penthouse tomorrow." Timothy smiled. "Go ahead." "Should I coordinate with building management?" "I'll handle it." Madison leaned against the doorway. "You seem relieved?" "I am." "Because of Chelsea?" He shrugged. "It was overdue." Madison studied him. "No regrets," Timothy answered without hesitation. "None." She smiled approvingly. "Sometimes people stay in our lives longer than they should." He nodded. "I've spent too many years carrying responsibilities that weren't mine." Neither realized how ironic that sentence truly was. Back inside Baker Property Holdings, the legal review continued. Richard projected a corporate ownership chart onto a large screen. Colored lines connected dozens of companies. Some held land. Others managed operations. Several existed solely for financing purposes. At first glance, the structure appeared impossibly complicated. In reality, it had been designed to protect long-term stability. One compliance officer spoke. "Most outsiders would never identify the final owner." Richard agreed. "That was intentional." Margaret added, "Privacy protects both the family and the residents." Chelsea listened quietly. She had reviewed the chart countless times before. Today it felt different. Today it would become evidence. Richard clicked to the next slide. The penthouse. Property records appeared. Original construction permits, transfer documents, occupancy agreements, insurance certificates, maintenance authorizations. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. The residence had never belonged to Timothy. Not for a single day. Chelsea looked down at the paperwork. She felt neither satisfaction nor anger. Only sadness. A marriage had reached this point because one person had stopped asking questions and started believing assumptions. Richard closed the presentation. Next issue. He opened another folder labeled Incident Documentation. Inside rested photographs from the lobby security system, time-stamped video stills, access logs, visitor records, security reports. Daniel Brooks had already submitted a written statement describing exactly what had occurred. Every employee who witnessed the confrontation had prepared individual reports before leaving work that evening. No one had been instructed what to write. Each statement described the same sequence of events. Timothy publicly instructed management to remove Chelsea. Daniel requested ownership verification. Chelsea departed voluntarily. Consistency strengthened credibility. Richard looked toward Chelsea. "This documentation is excellent." She answered softly. "The staff simply recorded what happened." "Exactly." Truth required very little editing. That afternoon, Chelsea met privately with Daniel Brooks inside the management office of another Baker property. Daniel stood as she entered. "I'm sorry for what happened yesterday." Chelsea shook her head gently. "You followed policy. I wasn't comfortable changing residency records." "You were right not to." Daniel hesitated. "I've managed luxury buildings for 23 years. Chelsea listened. "I've learned something." "What is it?" "The loudest person in the room is almost never the person with the greatest authority." Chelsea smiled for the first time in days. "My father used to say something similar." Daniel nodded. "I suspected there was more to the story." There was. "I contacted legal because procedure mattered more than appearances." Chelsea extended her hand. "Thank you." He accepted it respectfully. "I was only doing my job." That's exactly why it mattered. Later that evening, Richard sent formal legal preservation notices to Timothy, his company Baker Luxury Towers Management, and every relevant third party. The notices required that no emails, text messages, surveillance recordings, financial records, visitor logs, or internal communications related to the dispute could be destroyed or altered. Every document now had to be preserved. Every conversation might become evidence. When Timothy received the email shortly before 6 o'clock, he frowned. Madison looked up from the sofa inside the penthouse. "What is it?" "Lawyers." She rolled her eyes. "Already?" Timothy skimmed the notice quickly. "They're requesting preservation of records." "So, it doesn't matter." He tossed the phone onto the coffee table. "They're trying to intimidate me." Madison believed him. Neither understood that preservation notices were not threats. They were the quiet beginning of a legal process built entirely upon facts. Miles away, Chelsea stood alone on the balcony of her temporary residence. The summer air carried the distant sounds of traffic across the city. For the first time since leaving the penthouse, she felt something close to peace. Not because the battle had begun, because she no longer needed to carry it alone. From this point forward, documents would speak, witnesses would speak, records would speak, and the truth patiently preserved for months would begin telling its own story. 3 days after Chelsea left the penthouse, Baker Luxury Towers appeared unchanged from the outside. The lobby remained immaculate. Fresh flowers decorated the reception desk every morning. Valets greeted residents by name, and elevators opened with quiet precision. To anyone passing through the building projected effortless stability. Inside, however, subtle tension had begun spreading through the staff. Daniel Brooks noticed it first. Housekeeping supervisors whispered after meetings. The concierge paused before answering certain questions. Security officers reread visitor policies they had followed for years without hesitation. No one openly discussed the incident involving Chelsea. No one needed to. Everyone had witnessed enough to understand that something important was unfolding. Daniel had spent nearly a quarter of a century managing luxury residential properties. Experience had taught him that legal disputes rarely announced themselves with dramatic scenes. They arrived quietly, usually through paperwork, sometimes through silence, almost always through people becoming unusually careful. That Monday morning, Daniel opened his office door to find 2 envelopes waiting on his desk. One came from Baker Property Holdings. The other had been delivered by Richard Hayes' law firm. Neither envelope surprised him. He closed the door before reading them. The first contained formal instructions requiring that every security recording visitor log access card record maintenance request and internal communication connected to the penthouse be preserved without alteration. The second requested copies of specific operational records covering the previous 6 months. Everything was entirely lawful. Everything followed standard legal procedure. Daniel signed the acknowledgement forms without hesitation. He then called the head of security. "Michael, I need every recording from the main lobby, private elevators, parking garage, and penthouse corridor backed up immediately." Michael frowned. "All of them? Every minute? Should I overwrite the normal archive schedule?" "No." Daniel's tone remained calm. "Nothing gets deleted until legal tells us otherwise." Michael nodded. "I'll start now." Within an hour, multiple encrypted copies of the surveillance recordings had been created and stored according to company policy. No one attempted to review the footage. Their responsibility was preservation, not interpretation. Meanwhile, Timothy had settled comfortably into the penthouse. Or at least, he believed he had. Madison treated the apartment as though it already belonged to them. Designer catalogs covered the dining table. Fabric samples rested across the sofa. Paint color cards lined the kitchen island. She walked from room to room, making confident observations. "This wall should come out." She pointed toward the library. "The fireplace feels old." Another room. "We should replace all these family photographs." Timothy looked around approvingly. "I agree." Madison picked up a framed picture showing Chelsea with her parents many years earlier. "They're beautiful frames." She barely glanced at the photograph itself. "The frame can stay." Timothy took the picture from her. For several seconds, he studied it. Chelsea looked younger. Her father stood proudly beside her. Behind them rose the original Baker Tower shortly after construction had been completed. Timothy had seen the photograph countless times. He had never paid attention to the building in the background. He placed the frame back on the shelf. "We'll pack these away." Madison smiled. "It'll finally feel like you're home." The sentence pleased him. He no longer questioned why. Later that afternoon, an interior designer named Olivia Grant arrived carrying blueprints and digital renderings. She admired the apartment immediately. "This is extraordinary." Timothy smiled confidently. "It has potential." Olivia unfolded her plans. "I've prepared 3 renovation concepts." For nearly 2 hours, they discussed flooring lighting, custom cabinetry, imported stone, and redesigned living spaces. Olivia eventually asked the question she routinely asked every client. "When would you like construction to begin?" Timothy answered without hesitation. "As soon as possible." "Excellent. I'll prepare authorization documents." She opened her laptop. "I'll just need proof of ownership or written authorization from the property owner before permits are submitted." The room became unexpectedly quiet. Timothy spoke first. "I live here." Olivia smiled politely. "I understand. But city permits require ownership verification." Madison laughed lightly. "That's just paperwork." "It usually is." Olivia continued typing. "If you email me the property documents, we'll move forward immediately." Timothy nodded. "I'll have them sent." Olivia thanked them and departed. After the door closed, Madison looked toward Timothy. "You have those documents right." He hesitated only briefly. "The management office keeps copies." Madison accepted the answer. She had no reason not to. Downstairs, Daniel received another visitor. Emily Foster, the junior administrative assistant from Timothy's company, stood nervously outside his office. "Mr. Brooks, please come in." Emily closed the door carefully. "I don't know if I should be here." Daniel waited patiently. "I overheard something last week." She explained the conversation she had unintentionally heard outside Timothy's office. The words had remained vivid in her memory. "She won't be there." Daniel listened without interruption. Emily looked uneasy. "I don't want trouble." "You're not causing any. I just thought maybe it matters." Daniel thanked her. He made no promises. He simply wrote down the date, approximate time, and her contact information before placing the note inside a confidential file. Evidence often arrived through ordinary people trying to do the right thing. That evening, Chelsea met Richard Hayes inside his office overlooking Grant Park. Several large binders covered the conference table. Richard handed her another folder. Daniel's team completed the preservation process. Chelsea opened it. Every surveillance file had been cataloged. Every access record had been secured. Every witness statement had been indexed. She looked impressed. They moved quickly. They understood the importance. Richard sat across from her. "There's something else." "What is it?" He slid another document forward. "A contractor contacted Baker Property Holdings this morning." Chelsea looked down. "Interior renovation inquiry. Penthouse. Authorization pending ownership confirmation." She remained silent. Richard watched her expression. "No surprise." "Not really?" "You expected renovations." "I expected Timothy to start acting like the owner." Richard folded his hands. He still believes appearances are enough. Chelsea closed the folder. They've been enough for him so far. For now. Richard leaned back. "The law tends to be less interested in appearances." Chelsea nodded slowly. "That's why we're here." The conversation shifted toward strategy. Richard outlined each upcoming step: verification of ownership, formal responses to Timothy's attorney, preparation for potential litigation, protection of trust assets, coordination with banking institutions. Every stage would rely upon documentary evidence. Chelsea asked careful questions. She never once asked how to embarrass Timothy. She never asked how quickly he could be removed. Her concerns centered elsewhere. The employees. Richard looked up. "What about them?" "I don't want innocent staff caught between competing instructions." "We'll prevent that." "The residents. They'll experience as little disruption as possible." Richard smiled faintly. "You're still thinking like an owner." Chelsea answered quietly. "I've always been one." Across the city, Timothy hosted a small dinner inside the penthouse. Madison invited 2 close friends. Wine flowed freely. Music echoed softly through rooms that had once been filled with quieter evenings. One guest admired the view. "Incredible place." Timothy raised his glass. "It suits me." Another guest laughed. "So when's the housewarming party?" Madison answered first. "Soon." Timothy smiled. "We're making a few changes." No one questioned him. Why would they? Confidence often sounded convincing, especially when delivered from inside a multi-million-dollar penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago. Near midnight, the guests departed. Madison wandered onto the balcony. "You seem happier." Timothy joined her. "I finally feel like my life's moving forward." She slipped her hand into his. "It is." Far below them, city lights reflected against the river. Neither noticed the illuminated Baker Luxury Towers logo on a neighboring building. Neither considered the woman whose family name appeared there. Miles away, Chelsea closed another notebook after reviewing Richard's latest timeline. She looked out across the same skyline from a different building. The city belonged to no one. Buildings eventually outlasted every owner. Reputations rarely did. She switched off the lamp and prepared for another day. The legal process had begun exactly as she wanted. Quietly, methodically, without anger, without revenge, only with patience. Because patience supported by truth often became the strongest foundation of all. By the middle of July, Timothy had convinced himself that the most difficult part of his life was already behind him. Chelsea had left without a public argument. The divorce papers had been delivered. The penthouse remained under his control. Madison had settled comfortably into a routine that looked remarkably similar to the future they had imagined together. To Timothy, the silence surrounding the situation felt like confirmation. No one had stopped him. No one had challenged him. No court orders had arrived. No police officers had appeared at his door. He mistook patience for surrender. That misunderstanding would soon become expensive. On Tuesday morning, Timothy arrived at his office carrying a leather portfolio containing the proposal for the largest development project of his career. His company hoped to secure financing for an ambitious mixed-use complex on the outskirts of Chicago. If approved, the project would elevate Timothy from a respected executive to one of the firm's leading partners. The proposal depended upon confidence. Confidence from investors, confidence from lenders, confidence from institutions willing to commit hundreds of millions of dollars. Timothy believed he could provide exactly that. Madison entered the conference room carrying fresh copies of the presentation. "Everything's ready." "Good." The bank's representatives arrived 10 minutes early. Timothy smiled. "They're eager. They've heard good things." He adjusted his tie. "They're about to hear even better things." The meeting began precisely at 9. Around the polished walnut table sat senior executives from Timothy's company, representatives from a national commercial bank, outside financial analysts, and 2 attorneys responsible for reviewing collateral documentation. The presentation flowed smoothly. Projected revenue, construction timelines, market demand, residential occupancy trends, investment forecasts. Timothy spoke with confidence developed through years of experience. Questions came quickly. He answered each one without hesitation. The atmosphere remained optimistic. Near the end of the presentation, one of the bank's senior vice presidents leaned forward. "Mr. Cole." "Yes." "We're impressed by the proposal." "I appreciate that. We're also evaluating the financial strength supporting your leadership team." Timothy nodded. "Of course." The executive continued. "Several materials reference your extensive experience managing premium residential properties. I've worked in that sector for years." "We understand." Another banker opened a folder. "Our analysts also noted your residence within Baker Luxury Towers." Timothy smiled politely. "Yes. That level of market exposure is certainly valuable." "It has been." The banker looked down at his notes. "For internal risk assessment, we'd like to understand your relationship with those assets." Timothy answered carefully. "I've been closely involved with luxury residential operations." Technically, that statement avoided a direct lie. The banker nodded. "I see." Then another voice entered the conversation. It belonged to Laura Simmons, the bank's chief legal counsel. She had remained silent throughout most of the meeting. Now she spoke calmly. "Could you clarify one point?" "Certainly." "Do you hold any ownership interest in Baker Luxury Towers?" The room became noticeably quieter. Timothy chose his words with care. "I currently reside in one of the properties." Laura smiled professionally. "That wasn't my question." A brief pause followed. I asked whether you possess an ownership interest. Timothy maintained eye contact. My residence demonstrates familiarity with the market. Laura closed her folder. I understand. But ownership and residency are different legal concepts. One of Timothy's colleagues quickly intervened. Our proposal doesn't depend upon those assets. Laura nodded. I'm aware. However, our due diligence process requires accurate background information. She turned toward Timothy again. If ownership exists, documentation is routine. If it doesn't, we'll simply note that. The question sounded simple. Yet Timothy suddenly felt something unfamiliar. Discomfort. He forced a smile. I'll provide whatever documentation is necessary. Laura thanked him. We'll wait for your compliance package. The meeting concluded positively enough. No one rejected the proposal. No one accused Timothy of misrepresentation. Still, the atmosphere had changed. Questions now existed where confidence had stood only minutes earlier. As the visitors departed, Madison closed the conference room door. They're overthinking everything. Timothy loosened his tie. It's standard procedure. You have access to the documents, don't you? They're somewhere. Madison studied him carefully. Timothy. He looked away. I'll handle it. She wanted to believe him. She still did. But for the first time since their relationship began, certainty became slightly harder to maintain. Later that afternoon, the bank's due diligence department initiated its routine verification process. Analyst Kevin Marshall received responsibility for reviewing property-related disclosures connected to Timothy's background. Kevin approached the assignment without any expectations. He entered property databases, reviewed public filings, cross-referenced corporate ownership records. Most searches produced ordinary results. Then he reached Baker Luxury Towers. The ownership records immediately became more complicated. Individual buildings belonged to different companies. Those companies traced upward through multiple holding entities. The final ownership information was unavailable through standard public summaries. Kevin frowned. That wasn't unusual for major commercial portfolios. He submitted a request for expanded verification. Within an hour, additional records arrived from the bank's Commercial Legal Research Division. The ownership chain became clearer, not simpler, clearer. Baker Property Holdings, Baker Family Trust, Confidential Trust Administration, beneficial ownership protected under applicable law. Kevin highlighted several sections. Then he noticed something else. Nowhere did Timothy Cole appear. Not as owner, not as trustee, not as beneficiary, not as director, not in any recorded capacity. Kevin forwarded the file to Laura Simmons with a short note. Ownership relationship not established. Recommend additional clarification before underwriting proceeds. Laura read the message twice. Then she requested a formal title verification through outside counsel. Meanwhile, across the city, Chelsea sat inside Richard Hayes' office reviewing quarterly operating reports. She had spent most of the afternoon discussing elevator modernization projects and tenant satisfaction surveys. Business continued. Life continued. She had deliberately avoided asking Richard whether Timothy had encountered any legal difficulties. If something significant happened, Richard would tell her. She refused to measure progress by Timothy's problems. Richard closed one report before opening another. The bank has started asking questions. Chelsea looked up. So soon? They're performing standard due diligence. They discovered the ownership structure. Richard nodded, as expected. Chelsea remained thoughtful. They haven't contacted us. Not yet. They will. Richard leaned back. They're verifying facts before making conclusions. Chelsea appreciated that. Facts deserved patience. Assumptions deserved correction. Nothing more. Late that evening, Timothy returned to the penthouse carrying visible frustration. Madison met him in the kitchen. Long day, he sighed. The bank wants ownership documents. For the apartment. For everything they think I might control. She frowned. Can't management provide them? I'm waiting. That answer sounded less convincing than earlier ones. Madison poured him a glass of water. What if Chelsea refuses to cooperate? Timothy laughed dismissively. She doesn't own anything that affects me. The words came quickly. Too quickly, Madison noticed. You sound defensive. I'm realistic. She remained quiet. For the first time, an uncomfortable question entered her mind. How much did she actually know about Timothy's financial life? The following morning, Olivia Grant, the interior designer, called with an update. I spoke with city permitting. Good. They requested ownership authorization. I told you I'd send it. I know. She hesitated politely. They also contacted building management. And they said documentation must come from the registered ownership entity. Timothy felt irritation rising. I'll resolve it. I'm sure you will. After the call ended, he stared through the penthouse windows toward the skyline. The city looked exactly as it always had. Powerful, orderly, predictable. Yet invisible processes had already begun moving beneath the surface. Lawyers reviewed records. Banks verified ownership. Compliance officers compared documents. No accusations had been made. No lawsuits had been filed. Only questions. Carefully documented questions. Miles away, Chelsea finished another page in her notebook before closing it gently. She had written only one sentence. Truth usually arrives long before consequences. The consequences, she suspected, had finally begun their journey. The first indication that something had shifted arrived not with a courtroom summons or a phone call, but with an email. It reached Timothy's inbox at 8:42 on a Thursday morning while he was reviewing construction estimates for the proposed development project. The sender read Richard Hayes, Senior Partner. The subject line was simple. Notice of ownership verification and preservation of rights. Timothy frowned. He almost ignored it. Instead, he opened the message. There was no emotional language, no threats, no accusations, only professional courtesy. Richard informed him that his office represented Chelsea Baker regarding matters involving Baker Family Trust Baker Property Holdings and all affiliated residential assets. The email requested that Timothy immediately cease making any representations implied or otherwise regarding ownership authority or control over Baker Luxury Towers until all legal matters were resolved. Attached to the message were several certified documents: corporate registration records, trust administration certificates, property ownership summaries, copies of beneficial ownership declarations. Each attachment carried official seals. Each page contained certification numbers. Each signature had been notarized years before Timothy had ever met Chelsea. He scrolled through them once, then again. His expression slowly hardened. This is ridiculous. Madison looked up from across the office. What happened? Lawyers. She walked over. What do they want? They're pretending Chelsea owns the buildings. Madison blinked. Pretending? Timothy closed the laptop halfway. It's a pressure tactic. Can they do that? They're trying to intimidate me before the divorce. Madison studied his face. You don't seem convinced. I am. Then why are you angry? Timothy stood. I'm not angry. He picked up his jacket. I'm going downstairs. Where? To make a few calls. The office door closed behind him with more force than he intended. Madison remained standing beside the desk. Something about the documents she had briefly seen on the screen refused to leave her thoughts. They had looked official. Far too official to dismiss casually. Across the city, Daniel Brooks received a different email. It also came from Richard Hayes. Unlike Timothy's message, this one contained formal authorization for Daniel to cooperate with ownership verification requests initiated by financial institutions, insurers, auditors, and government agencies. Every response had to rely solely upon documented records. No opinions, no assumptions, only certified facts. Daniel smiled faintly. That instruction suited him perfectly. Facts had always been easier to manage than personalities. Around noon, the commercial bank contacted Baker Luxury Towers Management. The call reached Daniel directly. This is Laura Simmons from First National Commercial Bank. Good afternoon. We're conducting routine ownership verification regarding one of your residential properties. I understand. We're requesting confirmation concerning Penthouse 82. Daniel opened the secure property management database. He entered several authorization codes before the ownership records appeared. He reviewed them carefully. Nothing had changed. Nothing had needed changing. Laura waited patiently. Daniel finally spoke. Our records identify the beneficial ownership through Baker Property Holdings under Baker Family Trust. I see. Occupancy records list Chelsea Baker as the authorized resident. Laura made several notes. And Timothy Cole, Daniel answered exactly as company policy required. Mr. Cole has residency access through Mrs. Baker. Nothing more, nothing less. Laura thanked him. You've been very helpful. My pleasure. After the call ended, Daniel documented every detail in accordance with internal procedures. Time, date, caller, purpose. Information provided. Documentation mattered, especially now. Meanwhile, Timothy arrived unexpectedly at Baker Luxury Towers. He walked through the lobby with his usual confidence. Several employees greeted him politely, yet something felt different. The smiles appeared shorter. The conversations ended sooner. People seemed unusually careful with their words. He approached the reception desk. Daniel available? The concierge nodded. I'll let him know. Minutes later, Daniel entered the lobby. Good afternoon, Mr. Cole. I need to discuss something. Of course. They stepped into Daniel's office. Timothy closed the door. I've been told people are asking questions about ownership. Daniel folded his hands calmly. We receive verification requests from time to time. I don't want unnecessary confusion. I understand. Timothy leaned forward. If anyone asks, tell them I control the penthouse. Daniel met his eyes. I'm afraid I can't do that. Timothy frowned. What do you mean? I can only confirm information contained in official property records. I live there. Yes. I've managed everything there. Daniel remained composed. Residency and ownership aren't always the same. The sentence landed harder than Timothy expected. You think Chelsea owns it? Daniel chose his words carefully. My personal opinion isn't relevant. I'm asking what the records say. Daniel opened no files. He needed none. The records speak for themselves. Silence filled the office. For several seconds, Timothy simply stared. Then he stood abruptly. I'll handle this another way. Daniel nodded respectfully. I'm sure you'll do what you believe is appropriate. Timothy left without another word. Daniel watched the office door close. Then he quietly updated the incident log. Not because Timothy had threatened anyone, because accurate records protected everyone. Across town, Madison sat alone inside Timothy's office, reviewing pending correspondence. She had no intention of invading his privacy. She simply needed financial projections stored on his laptop. When she opened the email application, Richard Hayes' message remained visible. She hesitated. Then she read it. Not every attachment, only the opening pages. Corporate seals, certified copies, trust documents, Chelsea Baker, sole beneficiary, Baker Family Trust. Madison's heartbeat slowed. She reread the first page, then the second. She closed the laptop carefully. For nearly 5 minutes, she remained perfectly still. Final, so she whispered to herself. What if it's true? The possibility unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She had built an entire future upon Timothy's certainty. If that certainty proved false, she refused to finish the thought. Late that afternoon, Richard Hayes met Chelsea in a quiet conference room. He placed a thin folder before her. The bank completed its first verification. Chelsea opened it. They contacted Daniel. They did, and he answered exactly as policy required. She read the summary silently. Every statement matched the official records. No embellishment, no interpretation, only facts. Richard smiled slightly. This is how these cases usually unfold. Slowly, methodically. Chelsea closed the folder. I prefer that. So do judges. Richard slid another document across the table. This came from the trust administrator. Chelsea looked down. It was an internal memorandum authorizing legal counsel to proceed with formal protection of trust assets if continued misrepresentation affected commercial interests. She signed it without hesitation. Not because she wanted escalation, because responsibility required it. That evening, Timothy returned to the penthouse later than usual. Madison waited in the living room. We need to talk. He removed his jacket. About what? She looked directly at him. Does Chelsea own these buildings? The question hung in the air. Timothy laughed. Where did that come from? I'm asking. Lawyers are filling your head with nonsense. Madison didn't smile. I saw the documents. They're manipulating paperwork. Certified paperwork. They're twisting technicalities. Madison studied him carefully. For the first time since I've known you. She paused. I can't tell if you're answering me or convincing yourself. Timothy looked away, only for a moment. But that moment was enough. Madison noticed. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline shimmered beneath the setting sun. From a distance, every tower looked equally strong. Only those responsible for maintaining them understood that a building's true strength was never measured by what people saw above ground. It depended upon the foundation hidden beneath. Timothy had spent months building confidence upon assumptions. Chelsea had spent years building truth upon documentation. The difference between those foundations was about to become impossible for anyone to ignore. Fan 10. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was not called by Timothy. It was not requested by Chelsea. The meeting had been initiated by the Governance Committee of Baker Property Holdings after multiple ownership verification requests. From financial institutions, contractors, insurers, and outside counsel began arriving within the same week. For the committee, the issue was simple. Commercial confusion had to be resolved before it affected business operations. Nothing more, nothing less. The conference room occupied the top floor of Baker Property Holdings headquarters overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, while a long walnut table stretched through the center of the room. Every chair had already been assigned. Legal counsel, trust administrators, compliance officers, corporate governance representatives, building management, outside auditors, no reporters, no spectators, no unnecessary guests. Chelsea arrived first. She wore a charcoal gray suit, a white blouse, and carried the same leather notebook she had carried for years. She greeted everyone politely before taking her seat near Richard Hayes. There was no dramatic entrance, no attempt to command attention. Her calm presence seemed to lower the volume of the room. Several minutes later, Daniel Brooks entered carrying 2 secured document boxes. He nodded respectfully toward Chelsea. "Good morning." "Morning, Daniel." He placed the boxes beside his chair. One contained certified operational records. The other contained archived surveillance materials. Neither had been opened. Their seals remained intact. At precisely 10 o'clock, Timothy entered the room accompanied by his divorce attorney, Charles Monroe. Madison followed several steps behind. She had not been invited to speak. She attended only because Timothy insisted she remain nearby as administrative support. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Timothy looked around the room. His confidence remained visible, but it no longer appeared effortless. He noticed auditors, compliance officers, outside legal counsel, 2 independent trustees. This gathering was considerably larger than he had expected. Charles leaned toward him. "Answer only what you're asked." Timothy nodded. Richard Hayes stood. "Thank you all for attending." He spoke without emotion. "The purpose of today's meeting is limited." He looked around the table. "We are here to establish documented ownership, clarify management authority, and prevent further commercial misunderstanding." No one objected. Richard continued. "This is not a divorce proceeding. This is not a personal dispute. This is a corporate governance matter." The distinction mattered. Chelsea sat quietly. She had no prepared speech. Richard activated the presentation screen. A simple title appeared: Ownership Structure Verification. The first slide displayed Baker Family Trust. Below it appeared Baker Property Holdings. Below that, more than 30 subsidiary entities connected through clearly marked organizational lines. Richard spoke slowly. "Baker Family Trust." He indicated the top of the chart. "Created 27 years ago." Another slide. "Trust administration has remained unchanged, except for succession following the deaths of Robert and Eleanor Baker." Chelsea lowered her eyes briefly at the mention of her parents. Richard continued. "The current sole beneficiary." Another slide appeared. Chelsea Baker. The words remained on the screen. Nothing dramatic, only a legal designation supported by documentation. Richard held up a certified binder. "Certified trust records." He handed copies to every attendee. Auditors reviewed them. Trustees nodded. Compliance officers compared certification numbers. No discrepancies appeared. Charles Monroe quietly examined the documents beside Timothy. His expression changed almost immediately. Richard proceeded to the next section: Corporate ownership. One by one, he displayed incorporation records, shareholder certificates, board resolutions, annual filings, tax registrations. Every subsidiary ultimately traced back to Baker Property Holdings. Every controlling interest ultimately traced back to Baker Family Trust. Every decision requiring final approval ultimately required Chelsea Baker. Richard never raised his voice. He simply turned pages. Facts accumulated quietly, like bricks, one after another. Charles finally interrupted. "We acknowledge the trust structure." Richard nodded. Thank you. Our concern relates specifically to penthouse 82. Certainly. Richard clicked again. Construction permits appeared. Original architectural plans, occupancy authorizations, insurance registrations, maintenance agreements. Each document identified the same ownership chain. None contained Timothy's name, not once. Charles adjusted his glasses. Mr. Cole has resided there. Richard agreed immediately. Yes. There is no dispute regarding residency. He paused. There is, however, no documentation establishing ownership. Silence followed. Richard looked toward Daniel Brooks. Mr. Brooks. Daniel stood. Please describe building records. Daniel opened the first sealed document box. He removed certified copies rather than originals. Building management recognizes authorized residents and ownership entities separately. He explained the distinction carefully. Mrs. Baker appears as the authorized primary resident. Mr. Cole appears through resident authorization associated with Mrs. Baker. Charles spoke. So my client had lawful access? Absolutely. Daniel answered without hesitation. Until authorization changes through proper legal procedure. Richard nodded. Thank you. Daniel returned to his seat. Richard opened the second document box. Security records. He placed several still photographs on the display screen. Timestamps appeared beneath each image. The lobby, the elevators, the confrontation, Chelsea holding a suitcase, Timothy addressing security, Madison standing beside him. Richard pressed another button. A short video began playing. No dramatic music, only security footage. Timothy's voice echoed clearly through the conference room. My wife is moving out. The recording continued. Her access to the penthouse will no longer be necessary. Daniel's voice followed. Ownership records must first be verified. The video ended. Richard allowed several moments of silence. He then displayed another exhibit. Building incident reports, each prepared independently. Concierge statement, security officer statement, reception supervisor statement, maintenance technician statement. Every report described the same sequence of events. Every report confirmed Daniel requested ownership verification before taking action. Richard looked toward Timothy. Do you dispute making those statements? Timothy hesitated. No. Do you dispute the accuracy of the recording? No. Do you possess documentation establishing ownership authority? Timothy looked toward Charles. Charles answered instead. We have no ownership documents. Richard nodded respectfully. Thank you. There was no triumph in his voice, only acknowledgement. Madison sat motionless. She had expected disagreement, arguments, complicated legal interpretations. Instead, she had watched document after document quietly eliminate every assumption she had accepted as truth. She looked towards Timothy. He stared at the table. For the first time since she had met him, he looked uncertain. Richard turned off the presentation screen. We have one final exhibit. He held up Chelsea's leather notebook. Chelsea looked surprised. Richard smiled gently. With permission. She nodded. Richard did not read every page. He selected only entries corresponding to documented evidence already presented. Dates, conversations, observations. Nothing emotional, nothing exaggerated. Each note aligned with emails, security logs, calendar records, corporate filings. Richard closed the notebook. This journal proves nothing by itself. He looked around the room. But when independent records repeatedly confirm contemporaneous observations, he allowed the sentence to finish itself. An outside auditor spoke quietly. The consistency is remarkable. Another trustee agreed. It strengthens credibility. Richard returned the notebook to Chelsea. She accepted it with both hands, still without speaking. The governance committee chairperson finally addressed the room. Our responsibility is commercial clarity. He reviewed several notes before continuing. Based upon certified trust records, corporate documentation, operational records, and uncontested evidence. He looked toward Timothy. This committee recognizes Chelsea Baker as the sole beneficial authority connected to Baker Family Trust assets. He paused. Mr. Cole possesses no documented ownership interest in Baker Luxury Towers. The words landed softly. No applause followed. No celebration, only silence. Because everyone present understood they had not witnessed someone's victory. They had witnessed documentation doing exactly what it had been created to do. Separate assumption from fact. Fan 12. August arrived with clear skies over Chicago, but inside the offices of Baker Property Holdings and the law firm representing both parties, the atmosphere remained measured and deliberate. There were no dramatic confrontations. No reporters waited outside courthouse doors. No headlines announced a scandal. The matter was moving exactly as civil disputes were designed to move. Patiently, according to procedure. After several weeks of document exchanges, both legal teams agreed to attend a formal mediation before the court established a litigation schedule. The purpose was straightforward: determine whether the remaining disputes could be resolved without prolonged litigation. Richard Hayes explained the process to Chelsea during a meeting the afternoon before mediation. The mediator doesn't decide who's right. Chelsea nodded. I understand. He helps both parties determine whether an agreement can be reached. And if it can't, then the court continues. Chelsea closed the folder in front of her. I'll answer whatever questions I'm asked. Richard smiled. I know you will. You don't need to defend me. I never planned to. She looked at him curiously. You've already done the important work. What work? You kept records. The following morning, the mediation took place inside a private conference facility attached to the county courthouse. The rooms were intentionally modest. Neutral-colored walls, simple furniture, no raised benches, no witness stand. The setting encouraged conversation rather than confrontation. Chelsea arrived 10 minutes early. She wore another understated business suit carrying only her notebook and a thin folder prepared by Richard. She greeted the receptionist quietly before taking a seat. Several minutes later, Timothy entered with Charles Monroe. He looked tired. The confidence that had once defined every step had been replaced by caution. Moments afterward, Madison arrived separately. She had not been required to attend. However, Charles had requested that she remain available because portions of the divorce timeline referenced her presence during several events. She nodded politely toward Chelsea. Chelsea returned the gesture. Neither woman spoke. The mediator retired Judge Helen Morrison welcomed everyone into the main conference room. She had spent nearly 3 decades on the bench before retiring into private mediation. Experience had taught her that successful mediation depended far more upon listening than speaking. She looked around the table. Thank you all for being here. Everyone took their seats. Judge Morrison continued. We're not here to assign blame. We're here to understand facts. She turned toward Richard. You may begin. Richard stood. Unlike the governance committee meeting weeks earlier, today's presentation focused only upon issues directly connected to the divorce and property dispute. He projected a timeline onto a screen. Marriage, residence, trust administration, public statements, lobby incident, ownership verification, corporate findings, Every event appeared in chronological order. Every date matched previously disclosed evidence. Judge Morrison reviewed the timeline carefully. "Thank you." She looked toward Chelsea. "Mrs. Baker?" Chelsea met her eyes. "I have a few questions." "Of course." "Did you ever tell Mr. Cole he owned Baker Luxury Towers?" "No." "Did you ever sign documents transferring ownership?" "No." "Did you intentionally hide ownership?" Chelsea considered the wording. "I protected my family's privacy." "Why?" "My parents believed personal publicity created unnecessary risks for employees and residents." Judge Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Were trust documents available to your husband if he had asked?" "Yes." "Did he ever ask?" Chelsea answered quietly. "No." No bitterness entered her voice, only fact. Judge Morrison wrote several notes before turning toward Timothy. "Mr. Cole." He straightened in his chair. "Yes." "When you referred to the penthouse as yours." She paused briefly. "And thus, what did you believe?" Timothy answered honestly. "I believed I had authority because I lived there." "Did you verify ownership?" "No." "Why not?" He hesitated. "I assumed." The room remained silent. Judge Morrison waited. Timothy continued. "I assumed my marriage gave me equal authority." Richard made no objection. The answer spoke for itself. The mediator nodded slowly. "Assumptions can be understandable." She looked toward him carefully. Continuing those assumptions after questions arise becomes more difficult. Timothy lowered his eyes. "I understand that now." Charles Monroe requested permission to address one issue. Judge Morrison agreed. Charles stood. "My client acknowledges the ownership documentation." He spoke carefully. "We are not disputing Baker Family Trust." He looked toward Chelsea. "Our remaining concern involves practical transition arrangements connected to the residence." Richard nodded. "We're prepared to discuss those." The conversation shifted toward logistics. Personal belongings, moving schedules, access appointments, financial separation. Every issue received calm discussion. No one interrupted. No one raised a voice. After a short break, Richard introduced additional supporting documents. He did not overwhelm the room. He selected only the evidence necessary to confirm the timeline. Chelsea's notebook, email correspondence, building access records, bank communication logs, security reports. Judge Morrison reviewed each carefully. She eventually looked toward Chelsea. "I noticed something." Chelsea waited. "Your notes rarely describe emotions." Chelsea smiled faintly. "I didn't think my feelings would help later." "What did you think would help?" "The truth." Judge Morrison closed the notebook gently. "That was a wise decision." Meanwhile, Charles quietly reviewed the same entries. The consistency troubled him, not because they exaggerated events, because they didn't. Each note was remarkably restrained. Dates, times, short observations. Months later, independent records had confirmed nearly every entry. Such consistency carried significant credibility. Madison remained silent throughout the session. She had expected emotional accusations. Instead, she watched two attorneys discuss documentation with almost clinical precision. The contrast unsettled her. She remembered the afternoon in Timothy's office, when he confidently dismissed Chelsea as someone uninvolved with business. Now she understood how little either of them had truly known. During another break, she found herself standing beside Chelsea near a window overlooking the courthouse garden. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Madison broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Chelsea looked at her. You don't owe me anything. I treated you unfairly, Chelsea answered gently. You acted on what you believed. Madison lowered her eyes. I should have asked more questions. Chelsea considered that. We all should. There was no sarcasm, no hidden accusation, only quiet honesty. Madison nodded. I hope one day you can forgive me. Chelsea offered a small smile. I don't want to spend my life carrying resentment. The conversation ended there. No friendship began. No dramatic reconciliation occurred. Only two women acknowledging reality. Back inside the conference room, Judge Morrison summarized the day's progress. Significant agreement has been reached regarding factual matters. She looked toward both legal teams. Several financial issues remain, but ownership appears undisputed. Both attorneys agreed. Richard closed his final binder. Charles did the same. The mediator smiled gently. This is how the legal system works best. She looked around the room. When people allow evidence to replace assumption. The session adjourned shortly afterward. As everyone gathered their belongings, Timothy approached Chelsea hesitantly. She looked up. I never asked, he said quietly. No, I should have. Chelsea held his gaze. Yes. He searched for additional words. None came. Perhaps none were sufficient. Chelsea simply nodded politely before walking toward the exit with Richard. Outside, late summer sunlight filled the courthouse steps. People hurried past, carrying coffee briefcases and grocery bags, unaware that inside the building, months of silence had finally been transformed into a documented record accepted by everyone involved. There had been no shouting, no humiliation, no victory speeches, only evidence, only procedure, only the slow, steady work of truth finding its proper place. Nearly 6 weeks after the mediation concluded, the final court-approved property orders were ready for execution. Autumn had begun to settle over Chicago. The trees lining Michigan Avenue carried the first hints of gold and crimson, and cooler winds swept between the city's towers each morning. Residents of Baker Luxury Towers noticed the changing season far more than they noticed the legal process that had quietly unfolded behind conference room doors and attorney correspondence. That had always been Chelsea's intention. The dispute belonged in legal files, not in public spectacle. At 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, Daniel Brooks received the certified order from Richard Hayes's office. He reviewed every page personally before signing the acknowledgement of receipt. The instructions were precise. Chelsea Baker's ownership and residential authority remained unchanged. Timothy's authorization to occupy Penthouse 82 had formally ended under the court-approved settlement and accompanying residency documents. Building management was instructed to coordinate a peaceful transition. No security removal unless necessary. No unnecessary publicity. No disruption to other residents. Daniel read the final paragraph twice. It reflected everything he respected about professional property management. Dignity for everyone involved. He picked up the telephone. Mr. Cole, Timothy answered after several rings. Yes. This is Daniel Brooks. A brief silence followed. I've received the final authorization. Timothy closed his eyes. I expected that. We need to arrange collection of your belongings. When? The order allows 48 hours. Another pause. I'll cooperate. Thank you. Daniel ended the call. No celebration followed, only another completed procedure. Meanwhile, Chelsea met Richard Hayes at Baker Property Holdings to sign several remaining administrative documents. She reviewed each page carefully before placing her signature beneath the trust seal. Richard closed the final folder. That's the last one. Chelsea leaned back in her chair. It feels strange. What does something I've lived with for months is suddenly finished? Richard smiled. Legally. She nodded. Emotionally takes longer. It usually does. They stood together near the conference room window overlooking downtown Chicago. Richard broke the silence. Daniel asked whether you planned to be present during the move. Chelsea answered immediately. No. You don't want to witness it. I don't. Richard studied her expression. Why? She looked toward the skyline. Because the order isn't about winning. It's about closing a chapter. Richard nodded quietly. I'll let him know. That afternoon, Daniel met with the building's department supervisors. The meeting lasted only 15 minutes. He distributed copies of the transition schedule. The move begins tomorrow morning. He looked around the room. Our responsibility is simple. Professional courtesy, resident privacy, operational continuity. No photographs, no conversations with residents, no comments to outside parties. The chief concierge asked softly. What if someone recognizes what's happening? Daniel answered calmly. We continue doing our jobs. Everyone agreed. By Thursday morning, 2 moving trucks waited discreetly inside the underground loading area hidden from the street. Professional movers arrived on schedule. No television cameras, no gossip reporters. Only workers performing another assignment. Timothy stood inside the penthouse watching them wrap furniture and seal boxes. The apartment felt strangely unfamiliar. Just weeks earlier, he had imagined redesigning every room with Madison. Now most of the designer catalogs had already disappeared. Madison herself had not visited in nearly 2 weeks. Their conversations had become infrequent, brief, careful. After the mediation, she had gradually returned her attention to work rather than their relationship. Neither officially ended things, neither truly continued them. The distance had simply appeared, one ordinary day at a time. A mover approached Timothy. Sir. Yes. We've packed everything you marked. Timothy looked around slowly. Only a few personal items remained. His laptop, a framed university diploma, several business awards, one expensive watch resting on the kitchen counter. He picked up the watch. Months earlier, it had symbolized success. Today, it felt unexpectedly heavy. Daniel arrived shortly afterward. Good morning. Timothy nodded politely. Morning. Daniel reviewed the inventory list. Everything appears in order. I don't want any problems. There won't be. The 2 men walked through the apartment together. Room by room, item by item. Nothing dramatic occurred. No arguments, no accusations. When they reached the living room, Timothy stopped in front of the large photograph Madison had once suggested removing. Chelsea stood beside her parents. Behind them rose the original Baker Tower. He studied it longer than ever before. Daniel waited respectfully. Finally, Timothy spoke. I never asked her about this picture. Daniel remained silent. I saw it every day. Still, Daniel said nothing. Timothy looked down. I never noticed. Daniel answered only after several seconds. Sometimes we don't recognize what's important until we lose the chance to ask. Timothy gave a faint nod. I suppose that's true. The final box was sealed just before noon. Daniel reviewed the inventory once more. Everything is complete. Timothy looked around the empty apartment. Without furniture, the penthouse echoed. The silence reminded him of the morning Chelsea had quietly carried one suitcase through the front door. At the time, he had believed she was leaving behind everything that mattered. Now he understood. She had carried away the one thing the apartment could never provide. Peace. He picked up his coat. I'm ready. Together they rode the private elevator toward the lobby. Unlike the afternoon Chelsea had left, almost no residents were present. Daniel had intentionally scheduled the move during quieter hours. The elevator doors opened. The concierge offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cole." "Good afternoon." No one stared. No one whispered. The movers quietly transported boxes through the service entrance. Everything unfolded according to plan. Outside the building, Timothy paused on the sidewalk. The autumn wind carried fallen leaves across polished stone. He turned once more toward the tower, high above sunlight reflected from the windows of the penthouse. He wondered how many times Chelsea had stood there watching the city after he had already gone to sleep. He had never asked. Across town, Chelsea spent the afternoon meeting with operations managers about next year's capital improvement projects. Elevator modernization, energy efficiency upgrades, resident wellness programs, scholarship funding for employees' children. Business continued. Near the end of the meeting, Daniel called. "It's finished." Chelsea closed her notebook. "Thank you. Everything went smoothly. I'm grateful." "He cooperated." "I'm glad." Daniel hesitated. He looked different. Chelsea understood. So did I. After ending the call, she remained seated for several minutes. No sense of triumph arrived, only quiet closure. The chapter had finally ended exactly as she hoped. Without humiliation, without revenge, without turning another person's worst day into public entertainment. Late that evening, Timothy checked into a furnished apartment several miles away. The rooms were comfortable, smaller than the penthouse, simpler. He unpacked only the essentials. While placing books onto a shelf, one folded sheet of paper slipped from the back of a notebook. He opened it. It was an old anniversary card Chelsea had written years earlier. One sentence caught his attention. "Home is never the place we own. It's the person who quietly chooses to stand beside us every day." He sat on the edge of the bed reading those words again. Outside, another Chicago evening settled over the skyline. The towers still stood exactly where they had always stood. Only the people inside them had changed. And perhaps that had been the lesson waiting there all along. Fan 14. October brought crisp mornings to Chicago, and with the changing season came a quieter rhythm inside Baker Property Holdings. The legal files that had occupied conference tables for months were gradually transferred into long-term archives. Court orders had been executed. Property records had been updated. Financial institutions had completed their reviews. From a legal perspective, the dispute was over. From a human perspective, life simply continued. Chelsea returned to a routine that looked remarkably similar to the one she had followed long before the conflict began. She arrived at headquarters before 8 each morning. She reviewed operational reports before executive meetings. She visited different Baker Luxury Towers properties every week without advance publicity. She continued greeting maintenance workers by name. She continued asking residents whether repairs had been completed on time. She continued carrying the same worn leather notebook. Nothing about her success became louder after the legal victory. If anything, she became even quieter. One Monday morning, she met with the executive leadership team inside the headquarters boardroom. Large architectural drawings covered one wall. Financial projections occupied another screen. Richard Hayes attended only the first portion of the meeting before excusing himself. "The legal department has one final recommendation." Chelsea looked toward him. "What is it?" "We should conduct a complete governance review." The chief financial officer nodded. "I agree." Another executive added, "The ownership dispute exposed several communication gaps." Chelsea folded her hands. "Not legal gaps." "No." The executive smiled. Human ones. She understood immediately. Employees at different levels had followed procedures correctly. What failed had been assumptions made outside those procedures. Chelsea wrote one sentence in her notebook. Improve transparency without sacrificing privacy. She closed it. Let's begin. The governance review lasted several weeks. Every department participated. Building managers, human resources, legal affairs, finance, security, resident services. Chelsea insisted that every meeting include one question. What can we improve before another problem appears? The answers varied. Some requested clearer reporting channels. Others recommended additional training regarding ownership verification and authorization procedures. Daniel Brooks proposed a standardized protocol requiring any extraordinary residency instruction to be confirmed through legal administration before implementation. Chelsea approved it immediately. That protects everyone. Daniel smiled. It protects residents too. It protects trust. The revised policies were adopted across every Baker Luxury Towers property. No employee viewed the changes as punishment. They viewed them as clarity. Across the city, Timothy's life had become noticeably smaller. He still worked for the same company. However, the development project he had hoped would define his career had been reassigned to another executive, while the bank completed a broader restructuring of the financing package. His supervisor, Michael Donovan, invited him into the office one afternoon. "Please sit." Timothy did. Michael spoke carefully. "I want to be honest. I appreciate that. The company isn't terminating your employment." Relief briefly crossed Timothy's face. "But," Michael continued, "we're restructuring responsibilities." Timothy already understood. "My projects, some will transfer." "For how long?" "We'll evaluate things over time." The explanation remained professional. No accusations, no criticism. Simply reduced confidence from investors and lenders following months of uncertainty. Michael leaned forward. "This isn't only about legal documents." Timothy listened quietly. "Leadership depends upon credibility." The sentence lingered long after the meeting ended. Meanwhile, Madison had made decisions of her own. She requested a transfer to another division within the company, where her responsibilities would no longer place her in direct contact with Timothy. Human Resources approved the request without difficulty. On her final afternoon as his assistant, she knocked softly on his office door. "You wanted to see me?" Timothy stood from behind his desk. "I heard about the transfer." "Yes. You didn't tell me. I wanted everything finalized first." He nodded. "I understand." Neither mentioned the relationship that had quietly dissolved between them. There seemed little point. Madison finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot." "So have I." "I confused confidence with character." Timothy lowered his eyes. "So did I." She smiled sadly. "I don't think either of us meant to hurt people." "No. We just stopped asking important questions." He looked toward the window overlooking the city. "I stopped listening." Madison picked up the final box containing personal items from her desk. "I hope things get better for you." "You too." She left without looking back. It was a quiet goodbye, appropriate for a relationship that had slowly disappeared rather than dramatically ended. Later that week, Chelsea visited one of the oldest Baker Luxury Towers properties scheduled for renovation. The building superintendent greeted her warmly. "We've been expecting you." Chelsea laughed softly. "I hope not too long." He led her through mechanical rooms, resident lounges, and rooftop maintenance areas. She asked dozens of questions. How often were elevators serviced? Did residents feel safe? Were maintenance requests completed promptly? Could energy systems be modernized without increasing rent? To many employees, these conversations mattered more than board meetings. Chelsea understood that buildings earned reputations through ordinary daily experiences, not through marble lobbies. During lunch, she noticed a young maintenance technician eating alone. She carried her tray to his table. "Mind if I join you?" He looked startled. Of course. They talked about his family, his apprenticeship, his hope of completing engineering school at night. Chelsea listened carefully. That afternoon, she instructed Human Resources to expand the Employee Education Scholarship Program established years earlier by her parents. No announcement accompanied the decision. No press release. Only another policy change benefiting people who rarely appeared in corporate photographs. Several weeks later, the first scholarship letters were delivered. The young technician stared at the acceptance notice in disbelief. He never learned that Chelsea herself had approved the expansion. She preferred it that way. Near the end of October, Richard Hayes visited Chelsea's office carrying a single folder. No legal documents this time. She smiled. That's refreshing. He placed the folder on her desk. Inside were architectural concepts for a new affordable housing initiative proposed through the Baker Family Foundation. Chelsea reviewed the drawings carefully. I like this. It reflects your parents' vision. She looked toward the window. They believed success should leave something useful behind. And you. I believe they were right. Richard closed the folder. You've had every opportunity to focus on what happened this year. Chelsea nodded. I know. Instead, you're planning projects 5 years into the future. She answered quietly. If I keep looking backward, the buildings stop moving forward. Richard smiled. That's probably the healthiest sentence I've heard all month. Late that evening, Chelsea returned to the penthouse for the first time since Timothy had moved out. The apartment had been cleaned and restored exactly as it had been before the conflict. Family photographs once again rested on the shelves. The piano stood beside the windows, overlooking the river. Nothing felt different, yet everything had changed. She walked slowly through each room, not searching for memories, simply acknowledging them. She paused beside the photograph of her parents standing before the original Baker Tower. Her father's smile looked exactly as she remembered. Her mother's hand rested gently on his arm. Chelsea touched the frame lightly. I finally understand. The words were almost a whisper. They were never teaching me how to own buildings. She smiled to herself. They were teaching me how to protect people. Outside evening lights illuminated every Baker luxury tower across the Chicago skyline. Inside each building, thousands of ordinary lives continued without knowing the full story behind the quiet woman who had chosen responsibility over revenge. For Chelsea, that was enough. More than enough. Because lasting leadership was rarely measured by how loudly someone proved they were right. It was measured by how many people slept peacefully, because someone else had chosen to do the right thing. Fan 15. Winter arrived early in Chicago. The first snow of the season settled gently across rooftop sidewalks and the familiar skyline that Chelsea had watched from so many windows over the years. Baker luxury towers stood unchanged against the gray December sky, their lights reflecting softly across the river as residents hurried home from work, wrapped in scarves and heavy coats. Another year was quietly coming to an end. Inside Baker Property Holdings, preparations for the annual board meeting were underway. Department heads reviewed budgets. Maintenance forecasts were finalized. New development proposals waited for approval. Employee scholarship recipients had already completed their first semester, and reports showed remarkable progress. Business continued exactly as Chelsea believed it should. Steadily, responsibly, without unnecessary attention. On the morning of the meeting, she entered the boardroom carrying nothing more than a slim folder and the same leather notebook that had accompanied her through every difficult month of the year. The executive stood as she entered. Not because she expected it, because they respected the consistency she had demonstrated long before anyone outside the company knew her name. Chelsea greeted everyone with a quiet smile. "Good morning." The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. Financial performance exceeded expectations. Occupancy remained above projections. Resident satisfaction had reached the highest level in nearly a decade. Energy modernization projects were ahead of schedule. The expanded employee scholarship program had received overwhelming support. One executive looked toward Chelsea. "Congratulations." She tilted her head slightly. "For what?" "You managed one of the most difficult years this company has ever experienced." Chelsea looked around the room. "We all did." The executive smiled. "You always say that." "Because it's true." No one argued. Leadership, they had learned, sounded different when it belonged to someone who genuinely believed success was shared. After the meeting concluded, Richard Hayes remained behind. He carried one final envelope. "I've been waiting to give you this." Chelsea accepted it. "What is it?" "Confirmation." She opened the envelope carefully. Inside rested the final decree, formally dissolving her marriage to Timothy. Every legal requirement had been completed. Every signature had been recorded. Every filing had been accepted. The marriage had officially ended. Chelsea remained silent for several moments. Richard watched her patiently. "How do you feel?" She closed the document. "Grateful." He looked surprised. "Grateful?" "I'm grateful we reached the truth without destroying each other." Richard smiled. "Your parents would have appreciated that answer." She placed the envelope inside her folder. "I hope so." Later that afternoon, Chelsea drove alone to the cemetery where her parents were buried. Fresh snow covered the quiet hillside. She carried no flowers. Her parents had always preferred simple gestures over elaborate displays. She stood silently before the 2 headstones. For several minutes, she said nothing. The wind moved gently through the bare trees. Finally, she spoke. "I almost forgot what you taught me." Her voice remained calm. "I thought protecting people meant protecting them from pain." She smiled faintly. "It doesn't. It means protecting them with the truth." Snowflakes continued falling around her. The city beyond the cemetery remained busy, unaware of the quiet conversation taking place on the hillside. Chelsea closed her eyes briefly before returning to her car. Across town, Timothy's year had also reached a turning point. His professional responsibilities had stabilized, though, at a more modest level than before. The ambitious development project that once promised rapid advancement had been successfully completed under another executive's leadership. Rather than resent the outcome, Timothy had gradually begun accepting it. He spent fewer evenings chasing recognition, more evenings reading, listening, thinking. His furnished apartment had slowly become a genuine home. Not because it was luxurious, because it was honest. On one shelf rested the anniversary card Chelsea had written years earlier. He had never thrown it away. Sometimes he reread the single sentence written inside. "Home is never the place we own. It's the person who quietly chooses to stand beside us every day." Each time he read it, the words carried a different meaning. One afternoon, shortly before Christmas, Timothy visited a neighborhood community center where his company sponsored a volunteer construction project. The director introduced him to a group of high school students interested in engineering. One student asked, "What's the most important lesson you've learned working in real estate?" Timothy paused longer than expected. Several months earlier, he would have answered differently. He looked at the unfinished classroom around him. Then he smiled. Never assume you understand something just because you see it every day. The students waited. Timothy continued. If something matters, he looked toward the windows. Waser, ask questions before you make decisions. The director nodded thoughtfully. It sounded like practical advice. Only Timothy understood how much it had cost him to learn. Meanwhile, Madison had also begun a different chapter. Her transfer proved successful. She focused entirely on her career, avoiding office gossip and unnecessary attention. One evening, she received an invitation to speak with young administrative professionals beginning their careers. During the discussion, someone asked, "What makes a good leader?" Madison answered honestly, "Someone who values facts more than appearances." She smiled quietly. I had to learn that the hard way. She never mentioned names. She didn't need to. The lesson belonged to her now. A week before Christmas, Daniel Brooks walked through the lobby of Baker Luxury Towers, completing his usual evening inspection. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Residents greeted one another. Children laughed near the holiday decorations. The concierge welcomed guests with quiet professionalism. Daniel stopped for a moment beneath the bronze ownership plaque mounted on the wall. He remembered the evening Chelsea had looked toward it before walking out with a single suitcase. At the time, almost no one understood why. Now he did. The plaque had never represented wealth. It represented responsibility, the responsibility she had quietly carried, without asking anyone to admire her for it. On Christmas Eve, Chelsea returned to the penthouse after visiting several Baker properties, where employees working through the holidays received handwritten thank you notes from management. She sat beside the windows overlooking the city. The leather notebook rested beside her one final time. She opened to a fresh page. Unlike earlier entries filled with dates and observations, today's page contained only a short reflection. Truth never raised its voice. It waited. It endured. And when the moment finally arrived, it required no anger to be believed. Chelsea closed the notebook. She placed it inside a drawer rather than returning it to her bag. Perhaps she would not need it every day anymore. Outside, snow continued falling across Chicago. The towers stood quietly beneath the winter sky, sheltering thousands of ordinary families, beginning another holiday season. Chelsea watched the lights below and smiled. Not because she had won, because she had remained herself. Long after property records were archived, long after court files were closed, long after painful conversations faded into memory, that would remain the most valuable thing she still possessed. The hardest moments in life rarely arrive with warning. More often, they begin with small choices, an assumption left unquestioned, a conversation never held, a truth ignored, because confidence feels easier. This story was never really about luxury towers, legal documents, or valuable property. It was about character. Chelsea discovered that dignity does not require loud victories, only the courage to remain steady when everything familiar seems to fall apart. Timothy learned that success built on assumptions is fragile, while truth, however quiet, has a way of enduring. If this story stayed with you as perhaps it reminded you of someone who chose patience over revenge or integrity over pride, those stories deserve to be remembered because they reflect the kind of strength that often goes unnoticed in everyday life. If you'd like, leave a comment sharing where you're watching from and what part of the story resonated with you most. Your thoughts are always appreciated, and it's inspiring to see people from around the world connected by stories like this. If you enjoyed this journey, a like or a subscription is a simple way to help more people discover future stories of quiet courage, justice, and hope. Thank you for spending your time here, and until the next story, take good care of yourself.